For we are going to be finished, I think, with 2 Samuel tonight. At least that is my plan. It has been a long time coming. We have actually been in this very last chapter in 2 Samuel for a few weeks now, just because there's a lot in this chapter. And so, if you will recall, we actually, I believe, have gone through to the very last verse. So we've already read these things. I just want to make a couple of comments for you and help you to see some of the significance of this chapter, this closing chapter of 2 Samuel. And you'll remember, what is the occasion for this? Well, God has become angered at the people of Israel. Once again, why is not stated here in the text for us, but he is going to bring judgment upon them, and God has chosen to do that through this sin that David commits in numbering the people, basically taking a census of the entire nation. You may wonder, well, why is that wrong? After all, I mean, the book of Exodus, if you go to Exodus chapter 30, verses 12 and following, there are guidelines for how a census is to be taken of the nation. So God does allow for the people to be numbered. Again, there are laws in place to regulate that and how it's supposed to happen. And so why is it then that God becomes angry at David for doing this? And we talked about some of the options there. Is it maybe that David did not conduct the census in accordance with the Torah's demands in Exodus 30? Or is it more likely, I think more likely, that David, that this is an expression of pride on David's part, okay? He's acting like a king, like the other nations have. And remember, that was the whole issue with Saul. The people wanted a king like the other nations, and God gave them just that. Even though Saul had a really promising start as the monarch of Israel, it went south very, very quickly. And so David, of course, has been a model king in many respects, vastly different from Saul. Not a perfect man, obviously, very sinful man. We've seen that. And he falls here as well. We also talked about who was it who incited David to number the people. If you look at 2 Samuel 24, verse 1, it says that the Lord incited David to do this, because it is in punishing David for this sin that God is going to bring judgment upon Israel for the other sin that was already committed. God elects to do this through judging David's sin. But if you go over to 1 Chronicles and you look at the parallel text in 1 Chronicles 21, verse 1, who is it who incites David according to the chronicler? Satan. So is it the Lord, is it Satan, or is it both? Who's behind this sin? Well, I think the best way of approaching this is to recognize that this falls under the sovereign control of God. Very similarly to what we find in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. Who is behind Joseph's being sold into slavery? Well, obviously his brothers were the ones who did it, but what does Joseph say? You meant this for evil, but God meant it for good. So who also was behind this? God, because there was a plan in getting Joseph into Egypt, which of course would bring the rest of Joseph's family into Egypt, setting the stage for the Exodus and this great act of salvation in the Old Testament, which of course sets the stage for the greatest act of redemption, and that is the true Exodus, right? Okay, so we talked about all this. David is troubled. His conscience is stricken. He confesses his sin to the Lord. He's given an option. Okay, you got three choices here. David says, I'd much rather fall into the hands of the Lord than into the hands of men. So God brings a pestilence, a disease upon the nation. Thousands perish in this, but the angel of the Lord stops the destruction, stops the judgment where? At Jerusalem. And why does he do that? Well, what I think is going on here, and I mentioned this last week, you have basically the entire story being told up to verse 16 or verse 17. So the angel of the Lord in verse 16 was by the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. He's given a different name actually in the account in Chronicles, but it's the same person. In verse 16 again, the angel stretched out his hand toward Jerusalem to destroy it, and the Lord relented from the calamity. Well, then the question is, why does the Lord relent from this calamity? And so I think what's happening is, in the remaining verses of the chapter, you sort of, you rewind the clock a little bit, and you're given more information as to what's going on. And why is it, according to the rest of the chapter, that God stops this judgment? Because David offers a sacrifice at this particular site, the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. He purchases the threshing floor from Araunah. Remember, Araunah wants to just give it to him. You take it. He says, absolutely not. I'm going to give something for this. And he does. And according to the text, sacrifices are made and the plague is averted. So what kind of sacrifice is this? It's a propitiatory offering. What is a propitiation? Who was it who said, was it last week? Brady, was it you? A wrath averting? I'm trying to remember how you put it. Yeah, it's a great... To propitiate someone means to assuage their anger. Propitiation is not a term that we often use in English anymore, unless you're talking about what we're talking about tonight in a theological context. It's like justification. We don't often use the word justification much in ordinary everyday conversation, but it's an incredibly important concept, right? So the Bible says that the sacrifice of Christ was a propitiation. It was a sacrifice that turned away the wrath of God. Absorbed the wrath of God, turned it away. That's what it means to propitiate, to assuage someone's anger. And this sacrifice here was just that, a propitiation, to turn away the wrath of God from the people. The wrath falls on the substitute being sacrificed rather than the person who's being represented by the substitutionary offering. Well, we ended last Wednesday by looking at two other verses, and just very quickly, let's go ahead and remind ourselves of that. 1 Chronicles 22 verse 1, because we're given more information about this threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. So you can read the same story basically in 1 Chronicles 21. And when you come to 1 Chronicles 22 verse 1, we have, then David said, this is the house of the Lord God, and this is the altar of burnt offering for Israel. So David designates this spot that he purchases and where the sacrifice is made to avert the wrath of the angel of the Lord, who is judging the people with this disease that kills tens of thousands of them. And he says, according to the account in Chronicles, this is where the temple is going to be built. Remember, David wanted to build the temple in 2 Samuel 7. Why should I have this great palace and the Lord's in a tent? Okay. God says no. Again, you have to go to the account in Chronicles to get more information, because we're told by the chronicler that God said no because of David had too much blood on his hands, right? You're a man of war. You've killed a whole bunch of people. Your son will be the one to build this temple for me. And of course, that sets the stage for this great covenant that God makes with David, where he says, I'm going to build your house. You want to build a house for me? I'm going to build your house, and I'm going to establish your throne forever. One of your descendants will sit on your throne forever. One of the great Old Testament promises concerning the coming of Christ and what he would do, namely that he would rule, that he would be king, and that he would be a king in the line of David. That's why the New Testament is so keen to establish this fact, that Jesus is the son of David, as well as the son of Abraham. All right, so here is the spot. David purchases this threshing floor and names it as the site for the future temple that his son will build. We'll then go over to 2 Chronicles 3. 2 Chronicles 3, this is where we ended last week. Then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David at the place that David had prepared on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. Again, a different name. I mean, why is that? Well, we don't really know. I have 3 names. You have 3 names, right? People have more than one name. Could be the reason here. So this is where God appeared to David. This is where David made the sacrifice, and Solomon begins to build. But we're told what this place is. And what is it? Mount Moriah. Mount Moriah. David had conquered Zion. Zion was a Jebusite fort. This is the location that David said, okay, this is my capital city. Ornan, or Araunah, is just one of these Jebusites apparently that just sort of hung around. I guess he pledged his allegiance to David. So David builds his temple or rather his house sort of at kind of the peak. I mean, the land was actually rather small, only about 15 or 16 acres. That's the old city of Jerusalem. Obviously, Jerusalem has expanded much, much more since then. Well, just up the ridge, a few hundred yards, is this other mountain called Moriah, where David purchases the threshing floor of Araunah. Now, you got to get in kind of the mindset of a Jewish person or a Hebrew person. For a Hebrew, any body of water is called a sea. So the Sea of Galilee, for example, you've probably heard it many times. It's not what you and I would consider a sea. It's really just a lake, right? But this is how the Hebrew mindset was. It's just any kind of body of water is a sea. The Dead Sea, which is actually smaller than the Sea of Galilee, to the south. Again, the Dead Sea. Any hill is a mountain. So when you hear Mount Moriah, don't think, snow-cropped peak or snow-capped peaks, right? Any hill could be designated as a mountain. So this is about 2,000 feet in elevation, roughly, okay? So it's a giant hill. Just don't think like the Rocky Mountains here, okay? Now, why is this place, Mount Moriah, so significant? Well, we are going to run through this pretty quickly, so I hope that you're ready to go. I want you to turn back with me to Genesis chapter 22. Genesis chapter 22. Question before we look at Genesis 22. Name for me the significant characters in 2 Samuel 24. Sorry? 2 Samuel 24. Oh, I'm sorry. 2 Samuel 24. While you're turning to Genesis 22. We've got David, right? We've got Araunah. I mean, you could talk about Joab. Joab didn't want to take the census. You got David, you got Araunah, but there's another one who is quite significant in the narrative, namely the angel of Yahweh. The angel of Yahweh. The angel of Yahweh is the one who is bringing this destruction down upon Israel. I want you to remember that, okay? So Genesis 22. I'm going to have to read this pretty quickly, but I think that many of you, most of you, maybe all of you are pretty familiar with this story. So verse 1, now it came about after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, he said, here I am. He said, take now your son, your only son. Was he Abraham's only son? I mean, technically speaking, no. But he's singled out as the son of promise. So as far as the promise that God made to Abraham, he's the only one, right? I mean, because it's not through Ishmael that your offspring will be named. It's through Isaac. So it's almost like Isaac doesn't exist at this point because God is singling his focus, is centering his focus on this magnificent promise of what he's going to do through Abraham in bringing blessing to the entire world. Just look at Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. So notice, singled out your special son, all right? Kind of maybe reminds us a little bit of God so loved the world that he gave us his... the word monogenes, it means your unique, one-of-a-kind son, okay? All right, so take Isaac, your only son, whom you love, and go to where? The land of Moriah. Okay, interesting. And offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, of which I will tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son. He split the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham raised his eyes and saw the place from a distance. Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go over there, and we will worship, and we will return to you." This is why I think that the writer of Hebrews says in Hebrews 11 that Abraham thought that God would raise Isaac from the dead if Isaac was actually offered and killed, okay? Abraham knows. God has said it's this kid here that's the one that's promised, all right? So he's got to live in some fashion. So Abraham is absolutely convinced. Look, we're going there and we're coming back. Don't know how it's all going to work out, but we're coming back to you, okay? Extraordinary act of faith. Verse 6, Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. He took in his hand the fire and the knife, so the 2 of them walked on together. Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, "My father." He said to him, "Here I am, my son." And he said, "Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." So the 2 of them walked on together. Then they came to the place of which God had told him, and Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood and bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. Now, can we be absolutely 100% confident, 100% certain that this is exactly the place? I don't think we can say 100% because, remember, it's the land of Moriah. Go to the land of Moriah, to one of the mountains there. But the traditional understanding of this has been, and I think it's right, that this is none other than the mountain purchased, the place purchased by David. I don't think we would be told in 1 Chronicles 3 verse 1 that it was Mount Moriah if we are not to link it to this episode right here. Again, can I stand up here and say 100% it's absolutely certain? No, because again, the land of Moriah, one of the mountains. But I think you can make a very good case that this is none other than the place where later Araunah would have his threshing floor that would be purchased by David, and where another sacrifice would be made. But isn't it interesting that when we move on from verse 10, who else makes an appearance? You know, Brother Philip said Abraham and Isaac are 2 of the main characters in this drama, and he's absolutely right. But here's another one that comes into the picture. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham," and he said, "Here I am." By the way, the same thing that is said in verse 1. God calls to him. Abraham says, "Here I am." Now the angel of the Lord is calling to him, and Abraham responds in the very same way, "Here I am." In other words, here's your servant. Command me to do what you will. Now, why does he speak this way to an angel? I mean, this is an angel of the Lord. It doesn't say that this is the Lord, does it? Well, let's keep reading. Verse 12, he said, do not stretch out your hand against the lad and do nothing to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. There's clearly a distinction being drawn between at least two persons here. You have the Lord and you have the angel of the Lord. And the word angel just means what? Does anybody remember from our study of angels and demons? Messenger. It's a functional term. It describes what someone does more than what something is. So this is the messenger of Yahweh, but notice he's no mere messenger, because not only does he speak of God as another person distinct from him, he says, now I know that you fear God, but how do I know that you fear God? Because you have not withheld your son, not from him, but from me. You've not withheld your son, your only son, from me. You see, Abraham knows exactly who it is talking to him. I mean, it's like going back to the incident with Sodom and Gomorrah, the three men who come to Abraham there by the oaks of Mamre in Genesis 18. Abraham knows exactly who one of those men is, because, and the text explicitly identifies him as the Lord. God, Yahweh, made an appearance in human flesh to Abraham at that moment with two of his angels. Now Abraham hears from heaven the voice of the angel of the Lord, and he responds exactly as he had responded to the Lord speaking to him earlier. Here I am, here's your servant. This is a divine figure. There's distinction, but there's also sameness here. We're talking about, at this point, two persons, both of whom are God, the Lord and his messenger, his angel. Then Abraham, verse 13, raised his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the place of his son. This is a substitutionary sacrifice, is it not? In the place of his son. God said, give me your son, but you can actually just give me a substitute instead. I will accept the substitute in the place of your son. Verse 14, Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord, it will be provided. Isn't that interesting? In the mount of Yahweh. And what mountain is this? It's a mountain in the land of Moriah, and most likely the same mountain on which the Lord builds his temple. Which would make a lot of sense, right? The Lord will provide on his mountain. That's the saying. The Lord will provide on his mountain. By the way, Jehovah Jireh, the Lord will provide. This is not a promise about God giving you all of the little toys and trinkets that you want. It's not even a promise about God making sure you have enough food and clothing, although, of course, those things are promised to us. Just read the Sermon on the Mount. The Lord will provide what in this context? A sacrifice, a substitute, so that you and I don't die, right? That's the point. The Lord will provide. So who makes an appearance at this mountain? It's the same one who's there in 2 Samuel 24, the angel of the Lord. So this is the place where God accepted an offering in the place of Isaac. And this is the place throughout Israel's history. Again, I think we can say with a lot of confidence, I think that's why we're told in 1 Chronicles 3:1 the name of the place, because we are supposed to connect it to Genesis 22. And this is the place throughout Israel's history where God would provide and accept sacrifices in the place of his covenant people Israel. And although Jesus was not crucified, on Mount Moriah. Jesus, remember, was crucified outside the gates. This is what Hebrews says. He was like the scapegoat that is sent out on the Day of Atonement. One animal's killed, one takes the sins of the people into the wilderness. And so Jesus is crucified outside of the camp like this scapegoat who bears the sins of the people. So he's crucified outside of the gates of Jerusalem, but it is awfully close, is it not, to this place where Isaac is offered, where David offers the sacrifice to avert the wrath of God from the people. And of course, all of these things are pointing to the coming of Christ, who would be that final sacrifice. God's only Son, his Son whom he dearly loves, who is sacrificed in our place. One final thing before we end. Easy question. I've said it several times. But if you go back to 2 Samuel chapter 24, who makes the sacrifice? Just according to the plain-faced reading of the text, if you look at verse 25, who makes the sacrifice at the threshing floor of Araunah? It's David. He built an altar to the Lord and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. This is highly significant. Because if you go back to 1 Samuel chapter 13, Saul is rejected by God as being Israel's king. He says, I would have made you king. I would have made your family king in perpetuity. I would have put your family on the throne in perpetuity if you had not done this. And what is it that Saul does? He can't wait for Samuel, so he offers a sacrifice. And God rejects him as being king. Well, in 2 Samuel chapter 8, verse 8, if you go back over there with me just very quickly, 2 Samuel 8, verse 8, I pointed this out to you, but it has been a while. We have a list of David's officials. Chapter 8 is a list of David's triumphs. And so we have a list of names. If you look at verse 13, David made a name for himself when he returned from killing 18,000 Arameans in the valley of Salt. He put garrisons in Edom, and all of Edom he put garrisons, and so on. David reigned over all Israel. Verse 15, he administered justice and righteousness for his people. Then you have Joab, Zadok, Abiathar, or rather Ahimelech, the son of Abiathar, or priest. Sariah was secretary. Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, was over the Kerethites and the Pelethites. And then we have this really intriguing statement right there at the very end. In fact, it's so difficult that my preferred translation, the New American Standard, which usually nails the translation in so many places, but my rendering has it this way. At the very end of chapter 8, verse 18, and David's sons were chief ministers. But anybody else have a different term? So you may have said this back then, the Legacy Standard, which is just an update of the New American, they went ahead and said, yeah, that's not it. Chief ministers isn't good. Anybody got the ESV? Does the ESV say priest? Okay. King James, same thing? Well, it should be, because the word is Cohen, the Hebrew word, which means priest. David's sons were priests. By the way, it's the same word that is used up in verse 17, that Zadok and Ahimelech were what? Priests. They were Aaronic priests. God said, one tribe of the 12 tribes of Israel will minister before me, and that's the tribe of Levi. And among that tribe, there's one family that would have the priesthood. Aaron, Moses' brother. So Zadok and Ahimelech are Aaronic priests. But then we're told in verse 18 that David's sons were priests. Was David of the tribe of Levi? No. Tribe of Judah. So his sons are described as priests. Just a little bomb that goes off there in the middle of the text, and we're not told anything else. And then we're told on two occasions, lastly here in chapter 24, that David is offering sacrifices. What does that make David if David's offering sacrifices? A priest. A priest. Not an Aaronic priest. A priest from the tribe of Judah. So what do we make of this? Strange, is it not? Well, let me give you another one that's really interesting that was pointed out to me recently. If you go back over to chapter 7, 2 Samuel chapter 7, you'll remember from 2 Samuel 6, David brings the ark into Jerusalem. You guys remember this story? The guy reaches out his hand to stop the ark from tumbling off the cart. God strikes him dead. So David just, okay, let's hit pause on this particular thing. They shove it in some dude's closet and God blesses the socks off of him. Because the guy just doesn't go in there, right? Just leaves it alone. Well, then they decide, okay, look, the law says that we're actually supposed to have Levites carrying the ark, and they're supposed to do it on poles that are specifically designed for the purpose. You're not just supposed to throw it on a cart. In other words, you don't get to decide how to move God's throne around. This is God's decision. And so they finally bring in the ark into Jerusalem. David's dancing. You remember this? His wife, who's the daughter of Saul, is looking down going, "You're not supposed to be doing this. You're the king." David's like, "I don't really care. I'm going to become even more undignified than this." You guys remember the story. So what do they do with the ark when they bring it in? They put it in a tent. They put the ark of the covenant in a tent. Now, this is not the tabernacle. The tabernacle is still in Gibeon with all of the other pieces of furniture that are supposed to go in the tabernacle. Remember, the tabernacle was a movable temple that the children of Israel carried with them in the wilderness. It was a portable temple where God dwelt. But now we've got the ark, which is God's throne. Remember, God dwells above the cherubim and meets with the people there in the Holy of Holies. But now we are told in 2 Samuel, chapter 6, verse 17, so they brought the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent which David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. So this is not the temple. This is not the tabernacle. That's still in Gibeon. And you would have the table of showbread. You would have all the other, the altar of incense. You would have all of that that's still there. But this is a different tabernacle set up by David, and David's offering sacrifices. And then one other thing. I know that I'm way over. But there's something here that was brought to my attention recently that is just really interesting. If you go over to 2 Samuel 7, I know I'm cramming a lot in here. Ark is brought in. David makes a special tent for it. 2 Samuel 7, David says there needs to be a more permanent place for God to dwell. I need to build the temple. God says, no, your son's going to build the temple, but I'm going to establish your house. I'm going to establish your throne forever. David is overwhelmed by God's mercy to him. Who am I, God? I'm nobody, and you're going to do this for me? Well, look with me at 2 Samuel 7, verse 18. Then David the king, after the promise is made to him, went in and sat before the Lord. Where would this be? He goes in and sits before the Lord. Now, you might be tempted to read this as just he goes into kind of a quiet place, much like we might when we just want to be alone with the Lord in prayer. I don't think that's what's going on here. Because in the previous chapter, David had set up a tent for what? The tabernacle. And where does God dwell in Old Testament Israel? Above the tabernacle. David goes into that tent and sits in front of the Ark of the Covenant and is just contemplating how gracious God has been to him. Question: where was the Ark supposed to be if it were in the tabernacle, the actual tabernacle in Gibeon? In the Holy of Holies. Was just anybody allowed to go in there any old time and sit before the Lord? No. High priest went in once a year on the Day of Atonement. So here is David going into God's very presence, the holiest place in all of Israel, and sitting before the Lord like a priest. He's already been offering sacrifices. We saw that in chapter 6. In chapter 24, he offers sacrifices as well. David, guys, is a priest. And the text doesn't explain to us how this can be the case. But when you read the rest of the story, you recognize David's descendant, his seed, the fulfillment of that great Davidic covenant promise was a priest. In fact, the writer of Hebrews takes great pains to tell us how it's possible for Jesus to be a priest. And what's the answer to that conundrum? Because Jesus is from the tribe of Judah. He's not from the tribe of Levi. Well, the answer is you got to go back to Genesis. You got to go back to Genesis 15, because there's this mysterious figure called Melchizedek who is a priest before God. The writer of Hebrews is saying the Aaronic priesthood was always deficient. The Aaronic priesthood was never the priesthood that was going to bring an end to sin. The Aaronic priesthood was temporary, but God has always had a true priesthood, the order of Melchizedek. And so I think once again, we are being told in a very mysterious way, by the way, David is a priest. He doesn't get the Aaronic priest to come and offer a sacrifice to turn away God's wrath at the threshing floor of Araunah. He offers it. And so again, quite intriguing, and a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful type of David's greater son, the Lord Jesus Christ. And as Protestants, we love to talk about the offices of Christ, that Christ is prophet, priest, and king. And who is David? Well, he's king, obviously. In Acts chapter 2, at his great Pentecost sermon, Peter calls him a prophet when he quotes the Psalms. And here we have David, the forefather of the Messiah, as a priest. So, a lot to chew on. I'm still trying to wrap my head around this because it's fascinating. And how does it all work together? How are we to understand this? Is David some sort of priest in the order of Melchizedek? I don't have all those answers. I'm just presenting to you what the text says, which is fascinating, given that that Jesus, coming from the line of David, is also a priest. Yes, brother, Randy. Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I absolutely think so. I think that it is significant that this is where Isaac was offered. This is where the temple would be built. This is where the sacrifice is offered that turns away God's wrath toward Israel for this unnamed sin at the first part of chapter 24. So yeah, it all goes together quite well there. It all fits. Absolutely, absolutely. And again, I think that's why in 1 Chronicles 3:1 we're told this is Mount Moriah. We're not told that in 24. We're not told that in 1 Chronicles 22. But 2 Chronicles 3, it is Mount Moriah. And the audience, the readers, are just expected, they're just supposed to know what that is. Well, the only other mountain in Moriah is Genesis 22. And so I think it has to be the same location. So very good. All right. A lot there. Yes, brother. Yes. Yes. Right. And so, and of course, the author of Hebrews makes a point of this, that he was crucified and killed outside of the camp. So he's being linked there with, obviously he's being linked with the animal that's offered on the Day of Atonement that's killed, but he's also being linked with the scapegoat, the animal that survives and is sent out into the wilderness bearing the sins of the people, because the priest would put his hand upon the animal's head to transfer the sin of the people to that scapegoat. So yeah, absolutely. Now there is a lot about Jesus coming into the temple that we could, and we have talked about that, but the prophet Malachi makes a prophecy that the Lord will return to his temple. And in Malachi's day, it was the second temple. It wasn't Solomon's temple, because Solomon's temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. So it would have been what was later known as Herod's temple. And so Jesus had to be at that temple to fulfill that prophecy. So we're definitely not saying that there's not any significance to that location, because there most certainly is. But there was a necessity for Jesus to be crucified outside of the city in order also to fulfill the type of the scapegoat that's sent out into the wilderness. So good question, if that makes sense.
I'm curious about that same question while I was sitting here. So I did some digging myself topographically, like the traditional Golgotha, as opposed to where the temple is. It would seem, based on what I can see, that technically where Christ was crucified is still kind of up on that hill, down where the temple is, like the old
Yeah.
His gate's still up on that top of that hill, so him being crucified right outside the gate.
Right, yeah.
Still kind of up on that.
It was in the same vicinity. It was somewhere outside of the city gate, which is where the Romans would have wanted to crucify anyone, because you get passers-by coming into the city who see people hanging on a cross, and it's a great deterrent, right? So, now it has been suggested that Golgotha, the place of the skull, which was probably a hill that looked like a skull or was named the skull just because it's where executions happen, but some have suggested that it was Mount Moriah, but you can't say that. Again, we're told by the author of Hebrews he had to be crucified outside the camp. So the camp would be where the temple was. And so it had to be somewhere outside of there, but the fact that it's still connected to it, I think, is clear as well. So yeah, good point. Definitely in the same area. Okay. All right, brothers and sisters, let me pray for us. We'll be dismissed. Good to see you all. Next week, Lord willing, we'll start our new study. But hopefully tonight you got a lot to think about and chew on, and hopefully study more, and maybe we'll get a chance to talk about it again later. Father, thank you once again for your word, Father, for its depth. I know that I've learned a lot in relation to this topic, things that I had not learned previously. And so, Father, it's just a wonderful thing for us to be reminded once again about what all this points to. And that is to the coming of Christ, that David is a type of the Messiah, prophet, priest, and king. And already in the story of Old Testament Israel, we're getting these hints, these indications that as important as the Aaronic priesthood was, it was insufficient ultimately, because by the blood of bulls and goats, sin cannot finally be removed. And so having this indication here that there was a priest of the tribe of Judah outside of Aaron who is offering acceptable sacrifices, preparing the way for his son Christ to come and to make that final offering that forever takes away the sin of your people. And so thank you for Jesus. Thank you for what he did for us. Thank you for the gospel. And Father, thank you for our church. Thank you for the church that is scattered throughout space and time, the one universal church, the body of the Lord Jesus. And Father, we wish to give him all of the honor and the glory, the exalted Christ who sits right now at your right hand, ever living to make intercession